Greetings, community. My name is Anthony Morgan. I'm the manager of the Confronting AntiBlack Racism unit, and I'm incredibly humbled and honored to be joined today by Arshad Suliman, who's going to be delivering one of our commemorative lectures for Emancipation Month. Now, we know Emancipation Month is an opportunity for us in the city of Toronto to commemorate the historical fights that communities of color, but more specifically, Black communities have undertaken to ensure the advanced well-being and rights of Black people, not just in this city, but of course across the world. And so with that, I want to turn over to Ash to deliver our lecture, but I want to give a few words of introduction so you have a sense of who we have delivering this distinguished lecture today. So I'm going to take some time to read his bio. Arshad, or Ash Desai, is a second-year PhD student at the University of Toronto. He holds an MA and a BA in history, as well as the Black Canadian Studies certificate from York University. As an undergraduate student at York, Ash co-founded the Harriet Tubman Junior Fellows Initiative and organized the inaugural, quote, Blackness in the Academy, end quote, symposium. With an emphasis on oral history, his SSHRC-funded research seeks to uncover the role of Black Canadian activism in Southern African liberation movement in the mid-20th century. The role of Canadian Black organizations in the transnational struggles against anti-apartheid is important for its influence on Black activism's eventual pivot towards combating systemic racism in Canada. A colored South African born to an anti-apartheid freedom fighter, Ash knows the importance of oral history and its necessity in retelling the narratives of freedom fighters. He seeks to emphasize the importance of Canadian Black activism both within Canada and in African liberation movements. And so without further ado, I'm honored to turn it over to Ash for our lecture.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you to everybody that's watching today. So as Anthony had mentioned, my research focuses on the involvement of Black Canadians in the Southern African liberation movement struggle. Too often we get this notion that, when we look at the liberation struggles in Southern Africa, that Canada was at the forefront in kind of a different perspective. A lot of emphasis gets placed on Brian Mulroney, when often forgotten in the conversation is the role that Black Canadians played. And through my research with Black elders who have been an immense support within the community, what I've learned is that not only were our Black elders in our community involved in these liberation movements in terms of protesting and the boycott and divestment and sanctions movements that were occurring, but at the same time they were involved in other components that were occurring within the city as well. So whether it be anti-Black racism within the police force, starting with Albert Johnson and going forth until Michael Wade Lawson, and the formation of BADSI, these individuals who were part of that organization were also involved in the in the BDS movement in Southern Africa. But they were also involved in other components, the Black Education Program. Individuals such as Marlene Green and Sharona Hall were involved in understanding that Black women were getting the right representation during the 70s and 80s. You had the immigration reform that these Black elders were involved in as well. So when I think about Emancipation Month, I think it's too often we forget the long history, one, that Black Canadians have had in Canada. My research primarily focuses on the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but we need to go back to, Matthew DaCosta, who, the first Black person to arrive in Canada, and look at that long legacy of Black involvement and Black resistance within the country as well, and the creation of the nation state that it was. At the same time, there's also this kind of misnomer that, enslavement in Canada didn't occur. And, that's something else we need to look at with resistance. A lot of us are familiar with the story of Mary Angelique. Okay. And, we're familiar with the story, but we don't look further beyond that to understand this woman was enslaved, in Montreal, and her form of resistance, whether the story is true or not, was to fight the oppression that was occurring. We get, romanticized images of Canada being the Great White North, and I think that's something that we need to dispel. And at the same time, I think that also occurs when I look in my own research, because emancipation, yes, it ended bondage within the British colonies, but freedom is a different conversation altogether. And freedom in Southern Africa was something that didn't occur until 1994. And Black Canadians understood that, and they tapped into a Black transnational network during Black nationalism rising, during Pan-Africanism. They were involved in movements such as African Liberation Day, one of the most profound uncoverings I found. And it was essentially tapping into a network that was occurring in the United States, but was promoting the liberation of Africa. And Black Canadians in Canada connected with African Americans in the United States. Rosie Douglas was one of the keynote speakers at the event before he was arrested. And what the notion was to essentially uplift the Black community, make them aware of what was going on, and give I don't want to say voice, but give them more of an empowering feeling to become mobilized. In African Liberation Day as well, it became a very Canadian component as it progressed. It was hosted at Christie Pitts. You had key individuals like Dr. Akua Benjamin, who was there. When I spoke to Lennox Farrell, he remembers it fondly to say that it was a day where we came and $15,000 were raised. This is the one thing he told me, and it was supposed to represent each dollar the amount of years of oppression that was occurring within Southern Africa. And when I spoke to Dr. Benjamin, her most profound statement, I think it's what she talks about a lot, is that we're built to be resistant. There's resistances within our bodies. It's something that's always occurred. So it's something that we need to accept and understand that we're just coming from resistance. So African Liberation Day by the mid-70s started focusing on anti-Black racism in Canada, police brutality, anti-immigration sentiments that were occurring, additionally looking at the problems within the Caribbean that were occurring during that time, and the point system that was occurring that wouldn't allow Caribbean immigration to come to Canada, but would allow Europeans to. So it was a very encompassing feeling. But during my interviews, what I did uncover is the heavy police surveillance that occurred, and it started to occur before that, but surveillance at African Liberation Day was something that occurred too. We know the story of Rosie Douglas, but they were there watching and patrolling, but that didn't hamper the celebrations to occur. That didn't stop the celebrations from occurring.
For sure. Can I pause for a second?
Sure.
So, thankfully, because of the work that we do in the CABR unit and my own interest in advancing the understandings and education of our collective communities around our histories here, I'm familiar with Rosie Douglas, but not everybody is. Could you say a couple of words about? You mentioned him a couple times.
Right. So Rosie Douglas was a student who came to Canada from the Caribbean, was very active in Black nationalism, tapped into the Black national movement that was occurring in the United States. He was one of the leaders of the Sir George Williams Affair. And to contextualize, the Sir George Williams Affair was essentially, now what is Concordia University, was a group of Black students who were getting graded poorly. And they didn't feel that this was right. So what they did is they swapped their papers with their white colleagues, and they noticed that when they swapped their papers, the white colleagues got higher marks, and they still got lower marks. So they sat in at the computer lab at Concordia University, Sir George Williams University, protesting this obvious discrimination. And Rosie Douglas was basically said to be the forefront of this year. What happened subsequently after that, the professor wasn't fired, but Rosie Douglas and a few other Caribbean students at that time were actually deported back. And Rosie maintained that he was going to come back to Canada, and he became the prime minister of the countries from in the Caribbean.
Yes, Dominica. So yeah, we're looking at this is in 1969, I
Right.
believe it is. Yes. So thank you for sharing.
No problem.
I interrupted your remarks. I'm happy to hear more.
I mean, and that, I think something that I've spoken about, within Black community, is a multiplicity of these individuals, of these Black elders. We look at it now in this time frame and understand that we have organizations that are doing multiple things and amazing things. But our Black elders at that time were involved in so many things. I think of Charles Roach. He led in the 1980s a freedom ride to Ottawa, a freedom ride against apartheid. And yes, the name does harken back to the Freedom Movement in the United States. And what the Freedom Ride was to do was to go from Toronto to Ottawa to inform the Canadian government that they needed to divest. And this is the same time when scholars look back at Canadian history and Canada's involvement in the anti-apartheid movement with romanticized images and through rose-colored glasses. Charles Roach wouldn't have done that if the Canadian government was not heavily invested in the country. And one of the most amazing finds that I did I found was a letter that he had written to the Black Women's Congress, informing them about the rally and informing them about the ride and asking them for funding. So when I looked at that, it uncovered so much for me because I was like, there's different components here that are working together. And it also brings to the forefront, which we um, often forget when we look at this sort of history, the importance of women in these in the movements for independence and the movements of resistance. The Black Women Congress, at the end of the day, they had the money, they had the backing, and Charles Roach understood that. One of my favorite stories about Charles Roach is at the end of the day, and I have to make sure I write this when I reference it. He's not Canadian because he refused at his citizenship to acknowledge the Queen. So I always find that one of the most fascinating stories of Charles Roach is that he refused to do it. And then when Canada eventually divested, and apartheid was uh, seeming to come to an end, and the South African ambassador was being recalled back to South Africa. Lennox Farrell, he went to Ottawa and actually served the South African ambassador with eviction notices.
Wow.
And it's the same day that Nelson Mandela was actually arriving in Toronto. And Lennox, remember, Mr. Farrell talks about how his wife and his son went to go meet Mr. Mandela at the airport, but he was busy serving an eviction notice in Ottawa. So I mean, the stories that our Black elders have to tell is powerful, and I think that speaks a lot to the importance of oral histories, the importance of recognizing that, and not to sound too academic, but the importance of sources that are minimalized because of the understanding of what we're supposed to qualify as academics. So, I mean, for example, going to the archives and reading a transcript from a court document is somehow holds more water than an oral history with an interview who actually lived the experience. And I think that's what hopefully we need to open our eyes to. Oral histories are important and they are primary sources. It doesn't need to be interrogated, doesn't need to be questioned. It's that person's understanding of what occurred.
I appreciate you sharing that because we know that within our diverse Black communities, a lot of the histories and experiences that we've had, we've hold through those oral traditions and sharing and coming together, whether it be over food or just in a barbershop or a hair salon or just vibing in community over dominoes or any kind of socializing engagement. We share a lot of our histories and our traditions in those ways. And so we have that sort of basis of community recognition. But when it comes to things like Emancipation Month, in the city of Toronto, for instance, taking a step to say, okay, there's Emancipation Day, but going further and saying, okay, we're going to acknowledge Emancipation Month. Many folks saw that in Black communities, see that as an important and positive step forward. Other folks are somewhat suspicious. Like, why does the city, as a corporation, as a major entity, often also connected to experiences of violence and abuse that Black communities have experienced and are frustrated by, they are uncertain about this kind of historical recognition, official recognition from the state, effectively. So in your work as a historian, I wanted to ask you, what value do you see in official state organizations doing these kinds of recognitions?
So, I mean, for me, that's kind of a double-edged sword. And I remember, you know, my Black professors at New York and Dr. Andrea Davis always saying, why does there always have to be this moment of reckoning through Black violence? Why do we always have to start questioning anti-Black racism after an atrocity has occurred? So when I think of Emancipation Month, I understand that it's for me, the benefit would be the educational component. Informing the younger generation, informing individuals out there about the Black history in Canada. We have Black History Month, again, 1 month, the shortest month of the year. I fully dispute that. The long legacy of Black Canadian history in Canada should be taught side by side by the way we teach Canadian history in general. Emancipation Month, from a historical perspective, there's so much to it that I do find problematic. There's almost this notion of celebration that occurs in the empire, within the British. They're celebrating emancipation, but you started it, right? I mean, and then if
you started the enslavement.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
And so what are you celebrating? You're celebrating that you somehow grew conscious, and then to be too historical, but those atrocities then occurred further.
For sure. It somewhat reminds me of something that I've heard folks say. Actually, as a lawyer, one of the things in training that we talk about in law school is interesting questions that you can ask to lead a witness essentially, and one of the questions they often say is, so when did you stop beating your partner, right? Or like, so you ask the person to speak to that in a way that it sounds like it's a positive thing, but at first you're like, wait, why was this person beating their partner, right? And like that is the more problematic thing.
Exactly.
So you're not exonerating, you're not celebrating the person. And so similarly, when we think about the histories of struggle of people of African descent, Black folks experiencing enslavement, and the ways in which the formal passing of a law can be taken up by the empire to celebrate, then confuses narratives around who's this really about?
Mhm.
And I sense that when you're offering your
Yeah,
comments.
and I think I kind of missed the important part about your question, which is the benefit of Emancipation Month. Essentially, is these conversations. Obviously, these conversations are vital, but at the same token, the same way I look at Black History Month, these conversations don't need to be occurring just because of that. But these conversations also don't need to be occurring by two Black identifying individuals. Like, these conversations should have other scholars involved who do not know this history, or and just because it's frustrating at times to, as a Black identifying individual in academia, in history, in Canadian history, um, to look at individuals around me and look at their, either confusion or disbelief when we start talking about Black Canadian history. And I think that's something that the onus doesn't have to be on us to constantly be teaching. In academia, at some point you're going to have to learn about it. So whether it be um, the moment of reckoning, it's not our moment of reckoning. It's their moment of reckoning, and they also need to pick up those books.
Can I pick up on that? We talk about this moment of reckoning, and we're speaking very specifically about liberation struggles here in Canada, Black communities, very specifically in Toronto. You've spoken to. Often, folks push back uh, in community, and sometimes outside, often outside of community, and sometimes inside community, saying, "Well, when you look at it, Black folks have had it pretty okay. You look at the struggles that folks experience in the United States, the Caribbean, the continent." Latin
Mm-hmm.
America, it's bad for them. Whereas for Canada, we are a place of safety and safe haven. And so a lot of what we're importing from Black Lives Matter to Black nationalist struggles to Black Panthers, all of it's imported and it's unnecessary. And it's sort of this aggrandized narrative that is about other communities and it's not connected to here. So I want to ask you, how important do you think it is for us to have these conversations in Canada, locating struggles in Canada to speak to the experiences of Black communities across
I
our
think
city and the country?
it's vital. I mean, right? I mean, and it's too. There's a sanitization of Canadian history. That's simply exactly what it is. There's a sanitization of this notion of I didn't know, um, or the kind of dilution of enslavement. I mean, sitting behind a house and thinking to ourselves, the new kind of exhibit that's going on about a Black woman that was employed here, and kind of the narrative behind that being that she came as a refugee from the United States and was able to achieve sort of freedom here, is the narrative we get told. But the other side to that is that enslavement occurred in Canada. Um, and this notion that because it wasn't plantation slavery, enslavement somehow makes it less is bewildering. Enslavement is enslavement. It doesn't need to be some form of different levels or tiers of oppression for you to be enslaved. And that I think is problematic. But it's also, if we don't discuss these issues, if we don't problematize these questions, the thinking behind, oh, it's an imported ideology, it's an imported struggle, it's not that bad in Canada, all gets encompassed into that. And we need the information's there, the oral histories are there, the exhibits are there. So it is vital for us to have those conversations. It's vital to us to look at the long legacy of resistance. It's vital for us to look at, um, police brutality, the long history of police brutality on Black bodies in Toronto alone. And I mean, it took me a while to find it, but it was right there in the newspapers. And so, again, you have to problematize why Canadian historians not looked at this information a little further, and why is it left to our community to have to go in and talk and identify what it's about, because we basically sanitize Canadian history and assume that it's not that bad. The movements in the 60s and 70s and the 50s were tapping into a pan-Africanist movement that was occurring globally at that time. Without a doubt, that was happening. And Canadians' involvement in that was because there was oppression in Canada. There was anti-Black racism. There was anti-Black racism within the immigration system, within the justice system. So we need to talk about it. We can't just cast a blind eye to the fact that it's not in Canada. And that conversation continues today. I think of back to Trayvon Martin and the conversation about Trayvon Martin, the creation of Black Lives Matter. And I always think, what about Devontae Miller? We have a Trayvon similar situation with Devontae Miller, but we often forget about that conversation. And historically, it's something that's always occurred.
So thank you for speaking to that. And while we think about the importance of continuing to have these conversations, there are some folks who say, well, okay, yes, anti-Black racism exists, there's police brutality, there's these horrible stories, but sometimes folks feel like, hey, we are essentializing Black identity and connecting it too tightly to suffering. And that's all we have. Mm-hmm. And so that can be disempowering to young people or disempowering to community. And so if you could speak to that, how do we speak in an honest, nuanced way about our experiences of suffering and resisting injustice, while also not totalizing or essentializing the identity of Black people as being tied to hardship? Mm-hmm. How do you do that as a historian or just as a member of community?
I think personally, I think I have my own journey, and I think when I started in my undergrad in looking at police violence against Black bodies in Toronto, and I'll acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Michelle Johnson, because whose class she pushed me to go further with it and understand Dudley Law's involvement, and that's why I came to my research. I was understanding that Dudley Laws was being watched by the police, and in the same section, Dudley Laws was being monitored by Metro Toronto Police and other anti-apartheid movements, which that kind of opened everything up for me. And as I progressed further, Dr. Johnson would inform me, it would be disturbing. I'm a father, so I'd read the story about Albert Johnson, and I think to myself, this was the story itself was disturbing. It hurt, and then you're constantly rereading these stories of police violence, and you see the narrative play out.
Can you say a couple words about that story?
Sure. Albert Johnson was shot in his apartment. One of the second police incident that's kind of documented. First was Buddy Evans in 1978, then Albert Johnson in 1979. Both of these incidents kind of sparked a moment with Black Uprising in the city against Metropolitan Police, which is now Toronto Police. But again, to give a footnote, it doesn't make sense that those would be the first Black shootings. As I've previously mentioned, there's a long history of Black life in Canada, especially in Toronto. So again, these are the first documented. And you have to question, that's 1978. There's a long history. Where's that other information? And then, you move a bit further into 1988, and Lester Donaldson shot coming into his rooming house. So when I was going through this research, and again, like I said, it started in my undergrad at New York, and as I was going through this research, I started to understand that there was a common narrative. There's a common, the black person. At the time, it was before Sophia Kuku got shot in the 80s. It was a Black man who gets shot. The police launched some sort of investigation, and the officer is discharged. So when I was looking at this history, initially what I started doing was retelling the exact same narrative. And what I started to understand was, no, I'm just perpetuating this violence. I'm at fault now because I'm falling into this trap of commodifying Black life. Because there doesn't need to be the violence attributed to these individuals in order to tell exactly what happened to them, or in order to discuss the larger system of police violence in Black bodies. So as I progressed in my master's, again, my supervisor, Dr. Johnson, said, but why do you keep discussing this? And because it would sit with me. It would sit with me for a while about how uncomfortable this was. So I slowly started taking things away. I took away the police officer's name. I took away what actually happened in the incident. I took away the outcome, because it was going to be the same outcome all the time. So what I would focus on was instead, Buddy Evans' life or Albert Johnson's life. The fact that he had a daughter. I'm a dad. That was something that was important. And focusing more on the individual. Then I would focus more on the response by community, and not to mean that community was only responding because they were behind, because a situation occurred and community was responding, but there was a larger community at work that was already occurring. So you look at, the Underground Railroad restaurant, for example, where community was already meeting and having discussions. So I would look into that and discuss that as a component, because I mean, at the end of the day, Black life and the multiplicity of Blackness doesn't just exist with struggle. It doesn't just exist with violence. It doesn't just exist with this commodification of Black life. And to go back to an earlier comment I made about, this moment of reckoning that the Canadian state and kind of white society in general is having, they're having it on their own terms. So they want to have a moment of reckoning, but they also want to be sensational and they want to have salacious histories told about them. There was numerous times where I'd get asked to speak about the same history of police violence on Black bodies, to the point where I realized that what is this serving? Like, what purpose does this serve other than for you to be engaged in kind of with a voyeurism with regards to the violence on Black bodies? In Toronto, and again, I thought to myself, but this history's here. There was in the newspapers. There were news coverage of the incidents, and it could have been documented. And I look at my work by my current supervisor, Dr. Funke Aladajabi, and she looks at education. And with her, she focuses on the success of the Black education movement, especially by women. That doesn't necessarily just hark on the racism that was in it. It focuses on the positive outlooks, the community outlooks, the transitional programs at York, at U of T that were occurring for Black students that were coming in to able to, become involved in or get a university education. Her current work, like we work together, is on, Caribbean students that were coming in. And one of the things I find fascinating is that these individuals were being labeled by the Canadian government as being unable to speak English. And anybody from the Caribbean knows, other than Haiti, you speak English. I mean, as a South African, I get that notion tossed to me a few times that I speak another language, other than the fact that I speak imperialistic English. So, but that idea that it's all of a sudden become about the only way to tell Black history, especially in Canada, is about violence on Black bodies, is something that has to stop. It's something that diminishes us, and at the same time, it's back to York and through the Black Canadian Studies certificate program. One of the first things you learn is to say enslaved, enslaver, because you're taking the onus away from the word slavery. Because as soon as you say slavery, you diminish that individual as a person. So when you're constantly retelling violence and shootings and the resounding effects, all you're doing at that moment is you're taking agency, you're taking power away from that individual to make it another statistic.
Thank you for speaking to that. And what you're sharing is also making me think about, again, this notion of emancipation. If we are too tied to these narratives, or these narratives are too imposed on us, then it becomes limiting and reducing Black communities and Black struggles, Black culture, to these moments of suffering. But an emancipatory logic, energy, commitment means recognizing and speaking to those histories and the experiences of how they shaped us, but also recognizing that we've been and we continue to be so much more than that. And so I appreciate you sharing.
Just to add to that, as you were thinking about it, and you said emancipation. I mean, I started my work in the archives in Portugal, looking at 850 enslaved people in this town in southern Angola, and my friend and Michelle we would go through these registries because it would be difficult for me to go through it, because I'd read a registry that would say a 2-year-old or a 6-month-old, and next to it would say scarification, which means this person was branded. And it was this constant, exhausting feat that was taking a toll on me, to the point I had the conversation with my dad. And my dad told me, only recently, about our great-grandfather who was enslaved in South Africa. And when he was buried, we were Muslim, so we wash a body. He had the lashings on his body still, and the shackles were still attached to his feet. It's traumatic. It's something that we experience, but that's a personal narrative that I will go through and I will understand. But it doesn't need to be addressed in the history. It doesn't need to be talked about. That violence doesn't need to be talked about, because what that does, it creates that voyeurism. It creates that salacious image that somehow detaches the human part of enslaved people. And I'm guilty of it too. And I recently started working on a project with a jazz musician in Montreal, whose information was all in the archives. who left a memoir to talk about his life, which basically didn't talk about only struggle. His memoir was something that opened my eyes. He said, yeah, when I came back from the war, I encountered racism in housing. I didn't, I wasn't able to have the same housing that was afforded to white people. But in the next sentence, would completely move on. Because Black life, yes, it does encompass anti-Black racism. It does encompass the prejudice that we see on a regular basis. But that's just the part of life that we live, because there's so much more to Black joy.
Awesome. Thank you for speaking to that. So, if I could ask you a final question, it's somewhat of a scenario-based question. So, as a historian, imagine that yourself and a few other Black Canadian historians are asked to come together and change the curriculum. There's already a version of this kind of happening already, but for the purposes of this conversation, you specifically have been asked what story that you think needs to be told, reinserted, or augmented in the current Ontario curriculum that all Ontarians should know about, and in fact, all Canadians should know about in relation to Black Canadian histories.
That's a great question. I can speak for that for hours, but I think of during Black History Month, I was invited to speak in my niece's primary school, and she's in grade 6. I chose to speak in March because I would not speak in Black History Month. And I was impressed, but also not shockingly surprised by the teacher did a great job. He said, if you can focus for Black History Month on an individual who has somehow speaks to you. And he gave extra grades for if they focus on Black Canadians. So I found that impressive. There was a lot of understanding of Viola Desmond. There was a lot of understanding of Jackie Robinson's time in Montreal, those individuals. But you'd also have the same, Dr. King was in there, Malcolm X was in there, Nelson Mandela was in there, individuals that get more attention because of their place in the United States. For me, I think sitting and coming away from that class and then hearing this notion, especially with talking to my nieces and nephews and my daughter that, well, not my daughter anymore, but that the Canadian history is boring, is something that I think needs to be challenged right away. Again, American history gets focused on because of the salaciousness, because of the exposure we see about it. Canadian history right now is finally acknowledging our Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations around the world and the atrocities committed to those Indigenous nations. But Indigenous communities stop and make sure that that history doesn't become salacious, that there's a block-off point. And I think that's what we need to do. But to answer your question on how I think we need to change the curriculum, it needs to start from day one. So when we start talking about Confederation, we need to talk about Black settlement. We need to talk about Indigenous nations. Black Canadian history doesn't need to start in February in grade 6. It needs to be, starting with Matthew da Costa as a translator from Portugal landing. It needs to discuss Africville. It needs to discuss, Black hockey teams, Black baseball teams. There is a myriad of information that's available in Black Canadian history that needs to be chronologically discussed throughout education and throughout primary school, so that when a student comes to university, you're not, again, go back into York University and thinking of Black Canadian history as a third-year class where a professor is trying to teach you everything in 1 year, because you're sitting there my mea culpa, I didn't know half of this information because we just don't get taught it. And not to blame the system anymore, because you can only blame the system so many times, but the issue is we need to acknowledge Black presence in Canada, the longevity it's had, and we need to teach it side by side, because no history is going to be paramount to anything else. I mean, we understand that, Wilfrid Laurier, Ryerson, they're having their moment right now where they're being held to account. They need to be discussed in history with that component, not just because of Confederation.
Thank you for sharing that. You're reminding me of a quote from a Black Canadian historian, Afua Cooper, talks about, paraphrasing the quote, but essentially the story of Black Canadians in Canada is somewhat like, it's a history punctuated with disappearing acts, which again speaks to notion of the absented presence of Black people. So here, but also removed from our common narratives and understandings of how we've contributed to the building of this space. And I'd like to think and say, from our perspective in the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, having conversations like this and creating spaces for not just dialogue, but organizing, planning, strategizing for advancing policy and well-being for Black communities is about countering that narrative of erasure and displacement of Black people within the city, within this country more broadly. And so I want to thank you for your comments today, for your sharing, for all the wealth of knowledge you've offered us.
Thank you for having me. And I mean, to close, it's Black Canadian history. It doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be salacious. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to be angry when we discuss it. There's problems in the history and not being told, but there's powerful Black Canadian historians out there who I've relied on a lot that have given me, insight and information. Dr. Parrington Walker, I think I mentioned Dr. Johnson, Dr. Lajebi, you mentioned Dr. Cooper. There's Black historians that have been doing this work, and the information's there, and they don't tell one-sided narratives. And I think that's the part that is exciting as well. So, I mean, these conversations are amazing because we can sit and discuss it. There's so much to discuss. And so I appreciate it. And thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you.